After my husband passed away, I hid his $22 million pension. My own son tried to throw me into a nursing home. My only son pushed my wheelchair into a room that smelled of bleach and despair. He held a pen, a stack of papers, and a lie on his lips. He told me to sign my life away, and he didn't even have the courage to look me in the eye while he did it. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The cold of the Minnesota winter seemed to seep through the walls of the Maple Crest Care Facility. It wasn't just the weather, it was the room itself. The fluorescent lights hummed with a pale, bluish glow, making everyone look sick. An electric heater in the corner made a soft, hissing sound, failing to fight off the chill. Outside the large window, fat, wet snowflakes slapped against the glass and slid down, blurring the world into a gray watercolor painting. I sat there, 75 years old, in the wheelchair my daughter-in-law, Sloane, had insisted I use. She stood behind me now, her hands resting on the handles, a gesture that was meant to look caring but felt like a cage. Her perfume, something expensive and sharp, cut through the sterile scent of the room. My son, Parker, stood in front of me. At 46, he still had the nervous energy of a boy who was in trouble. He avoided my gaze, his eyes darting from the papers in his hand to the professionally smiling man beside him, Dr. Avery Kincaid. "Just sign it, Mom," Parker said, his voice strained. He placed the thick file on the small table in front of me. "It's just some routine medical forms. For your own good." Sloane's grip tightened on the wheelchair. "What Parker means is, we're here to help, Beatrice. To make sure you're taken care of." Dr. Kincaid nodded, his smile never wavering. "It's a simple assessment, Mrs. Langford. Nothing to worry about." Sloane pulled out an expensive-looking fountain pen. The cap came off with a soft click, a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the tense silence. She placed it on top of the documents. My heart, which had been pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, suddenly grew calm. The training from my years as the union treasurer took over. Fear recedes, focus takes its place. I ignored their faces, their placating words, their lies. My eyes went directly to the paper on top. I didn't need my reading glasses to see the bold black letters of the title. It was clear as day. It read, "Comprehensive Cognitive Assessment and Full Medical Power of Attorney." This wasn't a checkup. It was a coup. I slowly raised my head, my gaze passing over my son's pale, anxious face. I didn't stop there. I looked past him, past the doctor, and locked eyes with the person truly in charge. I stared directly at Sloane. 3 weeks after we buried my husband, Arthur, the scent of funeral lilies had finally faded from the house. It was replaced by the smell of brewing coffee and old paper. My warm oak kitchen, the heart of our home for 50 years, had become a war room. The kitchen table, usually set for family dinners, was now covered in stacks of documents, pension statements, union contracts, and legal pads, filled with my sharp, precise handwriting. My best friend, Nora Beckett, sat across from me, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Her presence was a comfort, a link to the past, but even she looked grim. On the center of the table, a speakerphone crackled to life. "All right, Julian, are you there?" I asked, my voice steady. "Loud and clear, Beatrice," came the slow, gravelly voice of Julian Crow, our lawyer and friend for 40 years. "Let's get our ducks in a row." I nodded at Nora. "I saw the writing on the wall at the funeral, Julian. The way Sloane looked at Parker, the questions she asked about Arthur's benefits. She's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And Parker is just letting her lead him by the nose," Nora added, disgust lacing her words. "He's so desperate for a win after that last business venture went belly up. Which is why we need to act now," I said, tapping a thick document titled ERISA. "I won't let my son's foolishness or his wife's greed destroy what Arthur and I built. I need a fortress, Julian, an ironclad, legally untouchable fortress." "And a fortress you shall have," Julian's voice assured us from the speaker. "We'll build it with 3 walls. Wall number 1 is the QLAC. Think of it as a time-locked vault. We'll put the bulk of the capital in there. Not even you can touch it until you're 85. It immediately stops any kind of cash grab dead in its tracks." "Everyone." I made a note. "Good. Wall 2? The Spendthrift Trust," he continued. This is our legal fence. We'll transfer the income, generating assets into it. The trust pays out your living expenses, but the principal is untouchable by outsiders. So if Parker's creditors come sniffing around, or if Sloan convinces him to make some catastrophic investment, this trust legally tells them to get lost. The money isn't theirs to be taken. Nora was already pulling the necessary paperwork from a file. She started feeding documents into the scanner on the corner of the table, its whirring sound a quiet hum of progress. And the final piece, Julian said, his voice lowering slightly, is the most important. It's the tripwire. We'll structure the trust with a no-contest clause and lock you in as the sole trustee. The clause will be very specific. If any immediate family member, namely Parker, challenges your competency or initiates guardianship proceedings, they are automatically and permanently disinherited. They get nothing, not a single red cent. It's harsh, Nora murmured, not looking up from her task. It's necessary, I countered. It's a deterrent, a shield. Nora reached into an old box of Arthur's files, pulling out a dusty ledger from the early days of the fund. As she opened it to scan a specific page detailing the initial seed money, her hand paused. It was just for a second, a barely noticeable hesitation. Her breath caught. I noticed immediately. What is it, Nora? She flinched, then quickly straightened the page on the scanner, her movements suddenly brisk. Nothing, she said, a little too quickly. Just dust, you know. It's hard looking at his handwriting. She cleared her throat. Arthur kept so many things. It was the first time Nora had ever lied to me. I felt a cold prickle on my skin, but decided to let it go. For now, there were more important battles to plan. The papers are on their way to you now, Julian, Nora said, her voice back to normal. The printer on the sideboard began to spit out signature pages. I watched the black ink form the complex legal language that would protect my life's work. Each page was a brick in my fortress. Nora got up and stamped each one with a red notary seal. The thud of the stamp was a final, decisive sound. My grief for Arthur was still a raw, open wound. But in that moment, it was channeled into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just a grieving widow. I was a treasurer getting ready for an audit. And I would not be found wanting. The first crack in the dam appeared 2 weeks later. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Weak sunlight filtered through the living room window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I was sitting in my favorite armchair by the fireplace, a half-finished cup of peppermint tea on the table beside me. The house was quiet, filled with the comfortable silence that follows a long life lived within the same four walls. Then, the silence was broken by the crunch of tires on the snow-covered driveway. I glanced out the window and saw a sleek, black SUV, the kind that cost more than my first house, Parker and Sloan. A few moments later, they were standing in my living room, bringing the cold air in with them. Sloan was all smiles, handing me a small, elegantly wrapped box. We brought you some tea, Beatrice. From that little shop you like downtown. Parker just stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Hi, Mom. Thank you, Sloan. Parker. It's lovely to see you both, I said, my voice even. I motioned for them to sit on the sofa opposite me. Sloan sat down with perfect posture, a living room predator in a cashmere coat. Parker slumped into the cushions beside her. We were just worried about you, Sloan began, getting straight to the point after a few moments of small talk. All alone in this big house. The winters here are no joke. I've managed for 75 winters, dear. I think I've got the hang of it, I said, taking a sip of my tea. Sloan let out a soft, rehearsed laugh. Oh, I know, you're tough as nails. But we were talking, and there are some wonderful new communities now. They're not like the old nursing homes. They're more like resorts. They have chefs, activities, on-site medical staff. It's about ensuring your safety, giving you and us peace of mind. She was a master of her craft. Every word was carefully chosen, dipped in honey to hide the poison underneath. She wasn't talking about a home. She was talking about a cage. I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something, to defend me or the home he grew up in. He just stared at his hands, refusing to meet my eyes. He was a stranger sitting on my sofa, As Sloane continued to paint a picture of this luxurious prison, a phone buzzed on the glass coffee table between us. It was Parker's. The screen lit up, and even from across the room, I could clearly see the caller ID, H. Pike. Parker snatched the phone as if it were a hot coal, his thumb fumbling to silence the call. He shoved it deep into his pocket, a flush creeping up his neck. He still didn't look at me. The name meant nothing to me then, but my treasurer's brain filed it away instantly. H. Pike. It was a piece of data that didn't fit. A loose thread. The conversation petered out after that. My polite but firm refusals to discuss the matter further left Sloane with nowhere to go. They stood up to leave. "Well, we just want you to think about it," Sloane said. Her smile stretched a little too thin. As they walked toward the foyer, her eyes swept across the living room. Her gaze paused, just for a second, on the old, cast-iron safe that stood in the corner, the same safe that had been there for 40 years. It was a quick, almost imperceptible glance, but I saw it. I saw the flicker of calculation, of greed. "Arthur was always so careful," she said, her voice light and casual. "I imagine the Steelworkers Union had its share of bad debts and shady characters back in the day. He must have kept everything under lock and key." "My husband was a man of integrity," I said, my voice turning cold as the winter air outside. "He protected what was his." The subtle jab hit its mark. A flash of annoyance crossed Sloane's face before she smoothed it over with another perfect smile. "Of course. We'll call you tomorrow, Beatrice." Induith. I watched from the window as they got into their black SUV and drove away, leaving perfect tire tracks in the otherwise pristine snow. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer a comfortable silence. It was the silence of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. They hadn't just come to visit. They had come to scout the terrain. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they would be back. To catch a fox, you have to think like a fox. And Sloane was a fox of the highest order. So, I decided to set a trap baited with exactly what she was hunting for, a weakness. My late husband's study was my sanctuary, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of old books and pipe tobacco. It was also the perfect stage. The next Thursday, knowing they were due for another one of their check-ins, I prepared it. I took out a document I'd had Julian draft a week prior. It was a single page, a laughably simple last will and testament. It left everything to Parker, but with no protections, no trusts, no legal firewalls. It was the kind of amateur document a grieving widow might write on her own, and the kind a sharp lawyer could tear to shreds in court. I folded it and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, leaving the drawer open just a crack. An invitation. The final touch was a small, digital voice recorder, no bigger than my thumb. It was a habit from my Union days document everything. I switched it on and tucked it behind a silver-framed photograph of Arthur and me on our wedding day. We were smiling, young and unaware of the battles that would come so many years later. They arrived right on schedule, bearing a box of pastries as their Trojan horse. We went through the usual dance of polite conversation in the living room. After a few minutes, I stood up slowly. "You know," I said, feigning a bit of forgetfulness, "I think I have that spiced tea you like so much, Sloane. Let me just go find it in the kitchen pantry. I'll be right back." It was the oldest trick in the book, but it worked. I left them alone. I didn't go to the kitchen right away. I stood in the hallway, my heart a quiet drum against my ribs, and I listened. I heard the soft creak of the study door, just as I knew I would. From my listening post, I couldn't see them, but I could imagine the scene perfectly. Sloane, directing Parker to stand watch at the door. Her, moving with silent efficiency to my desk. The soft scrape of the drawer opening. A pause. Then the quiet, almost inaudible click of a phone camera. Once. Twice. The scrape of the drawer closing. A few moments later, they emerged from the study, their faces perfectly composed. Sloane was smiling. "No luck on that tea, Beatrice?" "No, I'm afraid I must have finished it," I said, matching her calm. They didn't stay long after that. The purpose of their visit was complete. As I watched their SUV pull away, I felt no sense of victory, just a sour, bitter taste in my mouth. I walked back into the study, the room still holding the faint trace of Sloane's perfume. I retrieved the recorder from behind the photograph. I sat down in Arthur's old leather chair and pressed play. I heard the rustle of their coats, their hushed whispers. "Is this it?" Parker's voice, nervous and thin. "Quiet," Sloane's sharp reply. Then the sound of the drawer, a soft gasp of triumph. "Oh, you beautiful, stupid old woman. It's perfect, simple, easy to contest on grounds of diminished capacity." I heard the click of her phone. "What now?" Parker asked. Now we have our leverage," she whispered back. "She thinks she's in control. Let her play her little games." Then I heard the distinct sound of a text message being sent. I knew what it said without having to see it. The fox had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for it to spring. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The final attempt at a peaceful surrender came over a dinner I neither wanted nor enjoyed. Sloane had chosen the restaurant. It was one of those new, painfully trendy places downtown where the lighting was too dim and the prices were too high. The air was thick with the buzz of loud conversations and the clatter of silverware, a constant, nervous drumbeat against the backdrop of some kind of minimalist jazz music. I felt like a museum piece, out of time and out of place in my simple wool dress and pearls, amidst a sea of sharp suits and designer labels. We were seated at a small table draped in a ridiculously white tablecloth. Sloane sat opposite me, looking perfectly at home. Parker sat beside me, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. For the first 20 minutes, we played a game. We talked about the weather, the abysmal state of the local sports team, Parker's latest business idea that was still in the planning stages. A phrase I'd come to understand meant it was already failing. It was all a carefully choreographed dance, a prelude to the main event. Sloane, naturally, fired the first shot. She placed her wineglass down with a delicate click. "Beatrice," she began, her voice a smooth purr that barely rose above the room's din. "Parker and I have been doing a lot of thinking. About the future, about legacy." I simply raised an eyebrow and waited. "Your financial health is in excellent shape, thanks to your and Arthur's incredible foresight," she continued, as if she were giving a corporate presentation. "But we believe in a holistic approach. It's not just about managing assets, it's about managing quality of life. We need to be proactive, not reactive." "And what exactly does being proactive entail?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "It means getting all our ducks in a row," she said, leaning forward. Her smile was bright, but it never touched her eyes. "It means consolidating decision-making. We found a service. Think of them as a personal CEO for your later years. They manage everything from healthcare appointments to property maintenance. And in conjunction with that, we think it's time to seriously consider that residential community we mentioned. It's a turnkey solution for your long-term comfort and our peace of mind." She made it sound like a business acquisition. I wasn't a person. I was a portfolio to be managed, a problem to be optimized. I felt a surge of ice, cold anger, but I kept my face a placid mask. I turned my head slightly to look at my son. "Parker, is this what you want?" He flinched, finally forced to speak. He cleared his throat and pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He unfolded it and slid it across the pristine white tablecloth. His hand was trembling slightly. "It's just a formality, Mom," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the breadbasket. "It's a temporary medical power of attorney. Just so, I can help with things. Scheduling appointments, talking to doctors, in case something happens. It's just to make things easier." There it was, the knife, unsheathed and laid bare on the table between us. I looked down at the document. The language was dense, but the intent was crystal clear. It wasn't temporary, and it wasn't just for scheduling appointments. It was a key to everything, to my money, to my home, to my very freedom. As I stared at it, my hand brushed against my wine glass. A few drops of deep red wine sloshed over the rim, landing on the perfect white cloth. The stain spread instantly, a dark, ugly bloom on the sterile surface. It looked like a drop of blood. No one said a word. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Parker stared at the stain, as if he'd committed a murder. Sloane's smile finally faltered, a flicker of irritation in her eyes. I folded my hands in my lap and looked from the paper to my son, and finally to my daughter-in-law. My expression was calm, serene even. I offered them a small, soft smile. "You've given me a lot to consider," I said, my voice as smooth as silk. "Let me think about it." I stared at the document, the title burning itself into my memory. Comprehensive Cognitive Assessment and Full Medical Power of Attorney. The room was silent, the only sounds the hiss of the heater and the wet slap of snow against the window. All three of them, my son, his wife, and their hired gun doctor, were watching me, waiting for me to pick up the pen, waiting for the old woman to surrender. I folded my hands on my lap, over the thick wool of my coat. I raised my head and let my gaze rest on Parker. His face was a mask of anxiety, sweat beading on his upper lip. He couldn't hold my eye for more than a second. "No," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "I will not be signing this. Not today. Not ever." Parker flinched as if I'd struck him. "Mom, please," he started, his voice a desperate whisper. "Don't make this difficult. We're just trying to help. It's for your own good, I swear." "My own good?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You bring me here under false pretenses. You ambush me with a doctor I've never met, and you try to trick me into signing away my rights. How, exactly, is any of that for my good, Parker?" He had no answer. He just looked helplessly at his wife. Sloane stepped forward, her placid smile finally gone, replaced by a look of cold impatience. She cut Parker off before he could stammer out another word. "Very well, Beatrice. We had hoped to do this the easy way." She turned to Dr. Kincaid. "Doctor, would you be so kind as to give us a moment?" Kincaid nodded, ever the professional, and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Sloane pulled a sleek smartphone from her purse and tapped the screen. A man's face appeared, sharp and severe in a lawyer's suit. He was on a video call. "Mark, are you ready?" Sloane asked. "Ready when you are, Sloane," the lawyer's tinny voice replied from the phone's speaker. "The petition for emergency conservatorship is drafted and ready to file. I just need the word." My breath caught in my chest. This was it. The moment of truth. Sloane held the phone up, as if to make sure I could see. "Beatrice, this is your last chance. Sign the papers, and we can all go home and pretend this unpleasantness never happened. Refuse, and I will instruct Mark to file this petition with the Hennepin County Court, effective immediately. They will appoint a temporary guardian, likely Parker, pending a full hearing. The choice is yours." It was a perfectly executed checkmate, or so she thought. I looked at the phone, at the smug face of her lawyer. I looked at my son, who now seemed to be shrinking into the wallpaper. And I looked at Sloane, her eyes glittering with triumph. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the thrill of the fight I had been preparing for. I gave her my answer. "Do it." Parker let out a small, strangled gasp. "Mom, no!" But Sloane was already speaking. "You heard her, Mark. File it, now." "Filing," the lawyer's voice confirmed. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard. "The petition has been submitted to the court's e-portal. We should receive electronic confirmation momentarily." We waited. The silence in the room was electric. Parker was pale, looking back and forth between me and Sloane, finally understanding that he was a pawn in a game far bigger than he'd imagined. My own phone, tucked away in my purse, gave a single, soft buzz. It was the confirmation I'd been waiting for. The tripwire had been triggered. The lawyer's phone on Sloane's screen pinged. "There it is," he said. "Confirmation received. The court has accepted the filing." "Oh." Sloane switched off the call and turned to me, a victorious smirk playing on her lips. "It's done, Beatrice. It's over." "Oh, I don't think so," I said, a slow smile spreading across my own face. "Why don't you try calling your friends at Marrowband Capital, see if they're still interested in your little venture?" A flicker of confusion crossed her face. "What are you talking about?" "The trust, Sloane. The one you were so eager to get your hands on. You see, my lawyer, Julian Crow, is an old-fashioned man, but he understands modern technology. He set up an alert system tied directly to the court's filing database. The moment your lawyer filed that petition, the very second it was accepted, An automated directive was sent from Julian's office to the financial custodians of the entire $22 million fund. I let the words hang in the air, enjoying the dawning horror in her eyes. As of approximately 30 seconds ago, I continued, every asset, every stock, every last dollar of the Langford Family Trust has been placed under an emergency freeze. It's now locked in a temporary, non-affiliated community trust for the next 18 months, pending an investigation into potential elder financial abuse and coercion. You can't touch it. I can't touch it. No one can. You pulled the trigger, Sloan, and you shot your own plan right in the heart. For a glorious moment, she was speechless. The color drained from her face. I saw real, genuine shock. I had won. But then, something strange happened. The shock faded. The color returned to her cheeks, and the look of horror was replaced by a slow, cold, terrifying smile. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. "Good," she said, her voice a low, triumphant hiss. "Oh, Beatrice, you magnificent old fool. You did exactly what I wanted you to do." End of quote. A cold dread, colder than the Minnesota winter, crept up my spine. "You think this was about a quick cash grab?" She laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This was never about getting you to sign a piece of paper. This was about getting you to do exactly what you just did. This was about forcing a legal conflict." She took a step closer, her eyes boring into mine. "Because now, by law, since you and I are contested parties in a dispute over a frozen estate, I, as Parker's concerned wife, have the legal standing to demand what I could never get before. I have the right to petition the court for a full, comprehensive, forensic audit of the entire $22 million pension fund, from the day it was created until today." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You built your fortress, Beatrice, and I just tricked you into handing me the battering ram. Let's open up the books, shall we? Let's see just how clean Arthur's precious legacy really island." The preliminary hearing was held in a small, stuffy courtroom in the Hennepin County Government Center. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and floor polish. Everything was wood-dark, imposing, and polished to a high sheen that reflected the grim fluorescent lights above. I sat beside Julian at the petitioner's table, my back straight, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I was not intimidated. This was my home turf, facts, figures, and evidence. Across the room, Sloan sat with her lawyer, Mark. She projected an air of serene boredom, as if this were all a tedious but necessary formality. Parker sat behind them, looking haggard and gray. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't look at anyone. He just stared at a point on the far wall, a man already convicted by his own conscience. The judge, a woman named Espinoza with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, called the room to order. "Mr. Crow," she said, her voice crisp, "the court has reviewed the petition for emergency conservatorship filed by Mr. Parker Langford. The floor is yours." Julian rose slowly, a lion in winter. He was steady, methodical, and utterly confident. He laid out the timeline for the judge, speaking in calm, measured tones. He described the unwanted visits, the pressure, the ambush at Maple Crest. He presented my detailed journal entries, each one dated and timed, as evidence of a coordinated campaign of harassment. "Your Honor," Julian said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "this is not a case of a concerned son. This is a case of a calculated, predatory attempt to seize control of a $22 million estate by manufacturing a health crisis that does not exist." Judge Espinoza listened intently, her expression unreadable. Sloane's lawyer, Mark, occasionally made a note, but he didn't object. He was letting Julian build his case, letting him lay all his cards on the table. "And now, Your Honor," Julian announced, "we come to the smoking gun. With the court's permission, I would like to play an audio recording made by my client in her own home on the afternoon of January 24th. He placed a small digital recorder on the table and pressed a button. My own voice filled the courtroom, clear and steady, narrating the time and date. Then, after a moment of silence, came the hushed whispers from my study, Sloane's sharp, triumphant voice, Parker's nervous replies. Every word of their conspiracy to use the decoy will against me, captured perfectly. A low murmur rippled through the few observers in the gallery. Judge Espinosa leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. Parker sank lower in his chair, his face ashen. For the first time, a flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, crossed Sloane's calm facade. We had them, dead to rights. Julian switched off the recorder. As you can hear, Your Honor, this was a premeditated plot. Objection? Mark said, standing up smoothly. He wasn't rattled. He was calm, dangerously calm. On what grounds, counsel? The judge asked. Not on the grounds of authenticity, Your Honor, Mark said, a faint, predatory smile on his lips. We don't dispute that the recording is of our clients. We object on the grounds of incompleteness. Mr. Crow has presented a curated snippet of a much larger picture. We believe it's only fair for the court to have the full context. Julian frowned. Your Honor, this is a stalling tactic. It is not, Mark interrupted. And to prove it, we have our own audio files to submit into evidence. Recordings from the same time period, also made within Mrs. Langford's home, which paint a very, very different picture of her state of mind. A cold knot of confusion began to form in my stomach. What was he talking about? There were no other recordings. Judge Espinosa hesitated, then nodded. The court will allow it. Proceed. Mark nodded to his paralegal, who clicked a mouse. A new voice filled the room. It was my voice, but it wasn't me. The snow, my voice said, but it was different. It was thin, reedy, laced with a strange, trembling paranoia. It's not real snow. They're watching me through it. Arthur told me they would. The courtroom was utterly silent. I stared at the speakers, my mind reeling. I had never said those words. I had never even thought them. Julian was on his feet. Objection. Where did this come from? This is fabricated. It was recovered from the cloud backup of the same digital device your client used, Your Honor, Mark said smoothly. The metadata is intact. We have an expert ready to testify. Before Julian could respond, Mark signaled to his paralegal again. Another recording played. My voice again, this time sounding exhausted and hopelessly confused. Parker, just take the money, my voice sighed, a sound of utter defeat. Just take it. I can't keep track of the numbers anymore. The decimal points. They keep moving around. Just sign the papers for me, dear. You know what's best. The floor fell out from under me. That was the phrase from the decoy we're meeting. But the context, the meaning, it was twisted into something monstrous. It sounded like a genuine plea from a woman who had lost her mind. It was a perfect, damning lie, delivered in my own voice. What is this? I whispered, grabbing Julian's arm. Julian, what is this witchcraft? He was as stunned as I was, his face pale. He was an old warrior, a master of paper and precedent. He was completely unprepared for a ghost in the machine. He was on the ropes, and he knew it. Your Honor, Mark said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. As you can hear, Mrs. Langford is a woman in deep distress. She is suffering from delusions, memory loss. She records herself to try and keep track of reality, but as the evidence shows, her reality is tragically fractured. The recording Mr. Crow played earlier was not evidence of a conspiracy. It was a moment of paranoia, a loving son and his wife trying to calm a confused and frightened matriarch. He had taken my greatest weapon and turned it against me. My diligence, my meticulous record-keeping, was now being presented as proof of my own insanity. I looked around the courtroom. The observers were no longer looking at me with curiosity, but with pity. The judge's sharp, intelligent eyes had softened with concern. She was looking at me not as a petitioner, but as a patient. I saw Sloane then. She wasn't smirking. She wasn't gloating. She was watching me with a look of serene, reptilian stillness. She was the one pulling the strings, a puppeteer so skilled you could barely see the wires. Judge Espinosa cleared her throat. Given this, conflicting and deeply concerning new evidence, the court finds that the petition for a full forensic audit of the Langford Family Trust is warranted and hereby granted. She looked directly at me, her voice softening. And I am scheduling a full competency hearing for Mrs. Langford in 30 days. This court will appoint an independent medical examiner. She brought the gavel down. The sharp crack echoed in the silent room. It wasn't the sound of a recess. It was the sound of a cage door slamming shut. Julian Crow's office was on the 32nd floor of a skyscraper in downtown Minneapolis. It was a place I had always associated with strength and security, a fortress in the sky. But that night, it felt like a cage. It was almost midnight. Outside the panoramic window, the city lights glittered like a carpet of scattered diamonds, cold and indifferent. Inside, the only light came from a single green banker's lamp on Julian's massive mahogany desk, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of law books. Julian was pacing, his suit jacket off, his tie loosened. He ran a hand through his shock of white hair, a gesture of pure frustration I had seen only a handful of times in 40 years. "Deep fake audio," he muttered, the words sounding alien in his mouth. "It's a ghost. How do you cross-examine a ghost?" The judge looked at you, B. She saw a confused old woman. Their narrative is winning. I sat in one of the leather armchairs, a cup of tea long gone cold on the table beside me. The shock from the courtroom had subsided, leaving behind a hard, dense dread in the pit of my stomach. Nora sat in the chair next to me, silent and rigid. She hadn't said more than 10 words since we left the courthouse. She just stared into the middle distance, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. The phone on Julian's desk chirped. He snatched it up. "Yeah? I see. So they're not wasting any time." "Of course they are. Start with the foundation." "Understood. Keep me posted." He hung up, his face grim. That was my contact at the accounting firm the court appointed. The audit has officially begun. They've requested all founding documents, all transaction records from the first 5 years of the fund. A small, choked sound escaped from Nora's throat. It was so quiet, I almost thought I'd imagined it. But Julian heard it too. He stopped pacing and looked at her. "Nora, are you all right?" She didn't answer. She just gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Her gaze was still fixed on nothing. I felt that same cold prickle on my skin I'd felt in my kitchen weeks ago. The lie, the hesitation, the dust in her eyes. It was all connected. "Nora," I said, my voice low and steady. "What is it? What about the first 5 years?" She finally looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a terror so profound it stole my breath. "I'm so sorry, B," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I should have told you years ago. I wanted to, Arthur. Arthur made me promise." Julian and I exchanged a look of alarm. He pulled up a chair and sat down, his full attention now on Nora. "Promise what?" he asked gently. The story came tumbling out then, a torrent of words held back for decades. It was a confession. "It was the 3rd year of the fund," she began, her words rushing together. "There was a man, Frank Miller, a smelter at the plant. Do you remember him, B? His wife had that terrible illness, the one the doctors couldn't figure out. His medical insurance ran out. He took out a second mortgage on his house to pay the bills, but he fell behind. The bank was going to foreclose. He was going to lose everything. I remembered Frank, a good man, quiet, worked his whole life at the plant. Arthur was the head of the union," Nora continued, tears now streaming down her face, leaving dark tracks on her cheeks. "He tried everything. He set up a collection. He appealed to management. But it wasn't enough. They were going to be on the street in a week. Arthur, he couldn't let it happen. He said the union was a brotherhood, that it had to mean something more than just contracts and paychecks." She took a shuddering breath. "So he did something. He used his discretionary authority as the fund's trustee. He made a special transaction, an undocumented capital transfer. He moved $150,000 from the pension fund's reserve account to an anonymous holding company, which then paid off the Miller family's debt." The room went completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic, 32 floors below. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "He bent the rules to save a good man, B," Nora pleaded, her voice a desperate whisper. "He logged it as a long-term investment in a shell corporation, a ghost asset. He was going to replace the money himself over the next few years from his own salary and investments. He swore he would. But then the market took a downturn in '78, and then he got sick, and he never got the chance to fix it. He made me swear I would never tell anyone. He said it would tarnish the union's name. He said his legacy was protecting the workers, and this was part of it. Betrayal is a funny thing. It's not a loud, explosive event. It's a quiet, cold poison that seeps into your bones. My best friend, my confidant for half a century, had sat beside me while I built my fortress, knowing all along there was a gaping, fatal hole in its foundation. And my husband, my Arthur, the man I had placed on a pedestal, the man whose honor I was fighting to defend, was not the perfect saint I remembered. He was a man who stole. He stole for the right reasons, perhaps, but he stole nonetheless. Julian finally spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of the law. "A ghost asset," he said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "An undocumented transfer of that size from a federally regulated pension fund. They're not going to call that bending the rules. They're going to call it embezzlement. They're going to call it fraud." He was right. I knew he was right. Sloane's audit wasn't a fishing expedition anymore. She hadn't just tricked me into giving her a battering ram. Nora's secret had just told her exactly where to aim it. I stood up and walked to the window, turning my back on them. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I looked out at the glittering, indifferent city. The woman who had walked into this office tonight, the confident widow fighting for her husband's honor, was gone. In her place was a stranger, a fool who had built her life on a foundation of secrets and lies. I had never felt so completely, utterly alone. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the dark of my bedroom, the house silent around me, but my mind was a raging storm. Nora's confession echoed in my thoughts, a drumbeat of betrayal. Arthur's perfect image, the one I had polished and cherished for 50 years, had been shattered. And the audit, Sloane's masterstroke, was now underway, a team of strangers picking through the bones of my husband's life, searching for the very flaw I now knew was there. I felt trapped, outmaneuvered at every turn, a queen on a chessboard with no moves left to make. Despair is a heavy blanket. It smothers you. Sometime in the dead of night, I couldn't bear it anymore. I slipped out of bed, pulling on my thick robe. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Absolution? An answer? I was just a ghost haunting my own home, a home that now felt filled with secrets. I found myself standing at the bottom of the narrow stairs leading to the attic, my hand on the cold brass knob. The attic was Arthur's domain, a dusty archive of his life's work. I hadn't been up here in years. I pulled the cord, and a single bare bulb flickered to life, casting a weak yellow glow over a graveyard of forgotten things. Cardboard boxes, stacked high and labeled in Arthur's familiar scrawl. Old furniture draped in white sheets, looking like sleeping giants. The air was cold and still, thick with the musty scent of paper and time. I was grasping at straws, trying to find something, anything, that would make sense of the man he was. The man who could save a family with one hand and sign their ruin with the other. My eyes scanned the labels on the boxes. Contracts 1,970 to 75. Pension amendments. Grievance filings. It was the history of 1,000 working men's lives, all packed away in cardboard. Then I saw a smaller stack, tucked away under the eaves. The box on top was labeled simply, disciplinary actions. My old treasurer's instincts, the part of me that always needed the books to balance, took over. I pulled the heavy box out and set it on an old wooden trunk. My fingers, stiff with cold and age, fumbled with the lid. Inside were dozens of manila folders, each with a name typed neatly on the tab. Most were thin files, a reprimand for tardiness, a suspension for a safety violation. But one file, near the bottom, was different. It was thick, at least 2 inches, held together with a thick rubber band that had gone brittle with age. I pulled it out. The name on the tab made my blood run cold. Mercer, Daniel. I sat down on the trunk, the weak light from the bulb shining down on the folder in my lap. I opened it. The first page was a formal letter of dismissal, dated 1,981. The reasons cited: gross misconduct, including embezzlement of union funds and willful negligence of safety protocols, resulting in injury to a fellow worker. My heart began to beat a little faster. I kept reading. Page after page of testimony. Financial records showing small amounts of money siphoned from the workers' social fund over a period of 2 years. A report from an OSHA investigation detailing how Daniel Mercer had deliberately bypassed safety checks on a piece of heavy machinery to save time, leading to an accident that had cost another man 2 fingers. It was all there, in black and white. This wasn't just a firing, it was a scandal. Arthur had been forced to bring the hammer down, not just to protect the union's money, but to protect its members from one of their own. This was the story Sloan had hinted at, the bad debts and shady characters. Only the villain wasn't my husband. It was her father. Tucked into a sleeve at the back of the file was a small, black and white photograph stapled to an incident report. It was a picture of Daniel Mercer being escorted off the plant premises by security. He was a man with a bitter, resentful twist to his mouth. And standing just behind the chain-link fence, watching him go, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. She had dark hair and pigtails and was wearing a simple dress, but it was her face that made the air leave my lungs. Her expression. It wasn't the face of a sad child whose father had lost his job. It was the face of a soldier watching her king being overthrown. Her eyes were narrowed, burning with a hatred so pure, so adult, it was chilling. Her small mouth was set in a thin, hard line. It was a promise, a vow of vengeance. I stared at that little girl's face, at the furious fire in her eyes, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones. It was Sloan. The pieces didn't just fall into place. They slammed together with the force of a tectonic shift. Her marriage to my sweet, simple, easily manipulated son, her relentless ambition, her veiled questions about Arthur's legacy, her cold, calculated plan to dismantle my life, not for a quick payday, but piece by painful piece. This wasn't about money. It was about revenge. A 40-year-old grudge, nursed from childhood and honed into a weapon of devastating precision. The fog of despair that had clouded my mind for days finally lifted, burned away by the cold, bright light of understanding. The fear, the grief, the feeling of being a victim, it all vanished. In its place, something new and hard settled in my chest. Ice. I stood up, the file still in my hand. I walked over to a small table where an old framed picture of Arthur and me sat, covered in a thin layer of dust. Our wedding day. I looked at our young, happy faces, and for the first time since Nora's confession, I felt no confusion, no betrayal. I felt only a fierce, protective clarity. I finally knew my true enemy, and now I knew how to fight her. The battle for the money was over. The war for the truth had just begun. The day of the full competency hearing felt like the coldest day of the year. The courtroom was the same, but the atmosphere was different. It was heavier, charged with anticipation. The preliminary hearing had been a shock. This was to be the final judgment. We began where we had left off, in the shadow of the deepfake recordings. Mark, Sloane's lawyer, was smugly confident, believing he had an unassailable weapon. He didn't know we had spent the last 30 days preparing for this exact battle. Julian rose. Your Honor, before we address my client's competency, we must first address the fraudulent evidence submitted at the last hearing. I would like to call a Mr. Alex Sharma to the stand. A young man in a sharp suit, looking no older than 30, walked confidently to the witness box. He had bright, intelligent eyes and the calm demeanor of someone who is the smartest person in the room and knows it. Mr. Sharma, Julian began, could you please state your profession for the court? I'm a digital forensics analyst and a specialist in generative AI and synthetic media, Alex said, his voice clear and direct. For the next 20 minutes, Alex took the court to school. He didn't use confusing jargon. He used simple, devastating analogies. He called the recordings a vocal collage, explaining how software could stitch together syllables and tones from hours of real audio to create entirely new sentences. He showed the judge spectrograms, visual representations of the sound waves. Real human speech has a certain randomness, a certain organic flow, Alex explained, pointing to a large monitor. You can see it here in the authentic recordings from Mrs. Langford. Now look at the fraudulent recordings. See those unnaturally smooth transitions? The identical pitch on repeated words? It's too perfect. It's the digital fingerprint of an AI. It's a vocal puppet, Your Honor, and someone else was pulling the strings. He then delivered the final blow. Using proprietary software, we were able to trace the digital artifacts in the manipulated files. They were created using a specific commercial AI voice cloning program, a program for which the premium subscription is registered to a corporate account. He paused for effect. An account held by Mercer Public Relations, Sloan Mercer Langford's company. A bomb had gone off in the courtroom. The judge stared at Sloan, her expression now hard as granite. Mark was scrambling, objecting, but the damage was done. Alex had not just discredited the evidence, he had exposed the crime. The deepfake, their silver bullet, had just been turned back on them. Julian smiled. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor. He turned to our table, expecting to rest our case. But I wasn't finished. I placed a hand on his arm. Julian, I whispered. I need to speak. He looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise. B, we have them. We've won. We've won the battle, I said quietly. Now we have to win the war. He saw the look in my eyes and nodded grimly. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Beatrice Langford, wishes to address the court. Judge Espinoza looked at me. Her curiosity piqued. Very well, Mrs. Langford, you may approach. I walked to the witness stand, my steps slow but steady. I did not feel like a 75-year-old woman. I felt like a general taking the field. I sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked out not at the judge, but at Sloan. Your Honor, I began, my voice clear and strong. My son and his wife have tried very hard to paint a picture of me as a confused, incompetent old woman. They brought you fabricated evidence to support that claim. But their entire case, this entire ugly affair, is built on a much older lie. To understand what is happening here, you have to understand what happened 40 years ago. I reached down and lifted the thick, worn manila folder onto the ledge in front of me. This is the personnel file of a man named Daniel Mercer, Sloan's father. Sloan's mask of composure finally cracked. A flicker of pure animal panic flashed in her eyes. Parker looked as if he'd been turned to stone. Daniel Mercer was fired from the Steelworkers Union in 1981, I continued, my voice cold and factual. He was not laid off. He was fired for cause. He was fired for embezzling from the workers' social fund, and he was fired for criminal negligence that cost another man part of his hand. It's all in this file. The reports, the signed confessions, the evidence. I slid the file toward the court clerk. This whole sordid affair isn't about my health. It has never been about the money, not really. This is a vendetta, a 40-year-old grudge held by a daughter who has built her life on the false belief that her father was a victim, when in fact, he was a thief and a disgrace. I then turned to the matter of the audit. Sloan's lawyer has also made a great deal about a financial anomaly they discovered in the pension fund's early records, a transfer of $150,000 that was improperly documented. They would have you believe this is proof of my late husband's corruption. They are half right. It was improperly documented. But it was not an act of corruption. It was an act of justice. I reached into my bag and pulled out Arthur's old, leather-bound notebook. This was my husband's private ledger. In it, he detailed the real story. The money Daniel Mercer stole wasn't from the union itself, but from the disability and relief payments of the very family whose father he had injured. He was stealing from a crippled man. The union couldn't legally replace the funds without a lengthy and public lawsuit that would have bankrupted the Miller family in legal fees, so my husband made a choice. My voice grew thick with emotion, with pride. He made a choice to do what was right, not what was easy. He personally authorized the transfer to make that family whole again, logging it as a ghost asset with the full intention of repaying it himself. He broke a rule to uphold a principle. He protected his own. That was the man he was. I finally looked directly at Sloan, my voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying across the silent courtroom. The audit you demanded, Sloan, the weapon you thought would destroy my husband's name, has done the opposite. It has revealed his true character. It has cemented his legacy. I leaned forward into the microphone, my eyes locked on hers. My husband's legacy is honor. What is your father's? The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Sloane's face was a crumbling ruin. The mask was gone. All that was left was the raw, ugly hatred of that little girl in the photograph. Parker finally broke. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The house of cards he had built his life upon had just come crashing down around him. Judge Espinoza simply stared, her expression a mixture of shock and profound understanding. The truth, once unleashed, was a weapon against which there was no defense. The dust from the courtroom explosion settled over the next 2 days. The court's verdict was swift and decisive. The conservatorship petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. Judge Espinoza issued a scathing rebuke of Sloane and her legal team for attempting to defraud the court. The audit was halted. I was free. But I felt no joy. Parker came to the house on Sunday evening. He came alone. I watched from the living room window as his modest sedan pulled into the driveway, a world away from the gleaming black SUV he used to arrive in. He walked up the path, his shoulders slumped, a man carrying the weight of the world. I met him at the door and let him in without a word. We walked into the living room, the same room where this whole nightmare had begun with their carefully worded suggestions and false concern. The air was thick with unspoken words. The family photos on the mantelpiece of Arthur, of a younger, happier Parker, of me seemed to watch us, silent judges in our family's final trial. Parker didn't sit down. He just stood in the middle of the room, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Mom, he began, his voice raspy. He couldn't finish. The words wouldn't come. "Sit down, Parker," I said, my voice gentle but firm. He sank onto the sofa. I sat in my armchair opposite him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. I had placed 2 items on the coffee table between us before he arrived. On one side was Arthur's old, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with his steady, honest handwriting. On the other side was the small, cold, digital recorder that held the audio of Sloane's phone call with Hadrian Pike, the one Julian's investigators had uncovered, where they cheerfully discussed how they would carve up my assets once I was locked away. Honor and greed, sitting side by side. "This," I said, my voice quiet, tapping my finger on the notebook. "This is who your grandfather was. He broke the rules, yes, but he did it to protect a man who was being crushed by the system. He lived to protect his people, to build something that would last." I then pushed the small recorder across the table toward him. "And this is the world you chose to live in. A world of backroom deals and whispers, where a person's life is just a number on a balance sheet." I leaned forward, my eyes holding his, forcing him to finally look at me. "Your father lived for others, Parker. What have you lived for?" A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "I'm giving you 2 choices," I continued, my voice even, though every word felt like a shard of glass in my throat. "2 envelopes, 2 paths. You will choose one before you leave this house tonight." I laid 2 plain white envelopes on the table. The first envelope contains a plan. It requires you to go to the district attorney's office tomorrow morning and give them a full, sworn confession. You will tell them everything you know about Sloane's plan, about Marrowbend Capital's involvement, about the deep fake audio. You will become the state's primary witness. You will face the music, whatever that may be. You will cut Sloane loose, file for divorce, and start your life over from absolute zero. I will help you with a small, supervised living stipend, but you will not see a single dollar of inheritance for at least 10 years. It's a path back to being a man your father would recognize, but it's the hardest road you will ever walk. His eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and a faint, desperate flicker of hope. "The second envelope," I said, my voice dropping, "contains a check for $50,000. It is the last money you will ever receive from this family. You can take it and disappear. Change your name, move to another state. I don't care. But if you walk out that door with that check, you are no longer my son. You will be written out of the will, out of the trust, out of our lives permanently. This door will be closed to you forever." He stared at the 2 envelopes as if they were a bomb and its detonator. The choice between a painful redemption and a painless exile. He finally broke. The sound that came out of him was a ragged, guttural sob of pure, undiluted grief. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking. It wasn't the cry of a man who was sorry he got caught. It was the cry of a man who finally understood the depth of his own failure, the hollowness of his own soul. I wanted to go to him, to hold him like I did when he was a little boy who had fallen and scraped his knee. But I couldn't. I had to be the judge now, not just the mother. I sat there, my own hands trembling in my lap, and watched my son's world fall apart. It was not the sweet satisfaction of victory. It was the sharp, metallic taste of surgery, cutting away a diseased part of my own family to save what was left. On the mantelpiece, a silver-framed photo of Parker and Sloane on their wedding day seemed to mock the entire room. It was a picture of a lie, and it had to be taken down. 6 months can change everything. The brutal Minnesota winter had finally surrendered to a glorious June. The ice on the lake had long since melted, and now the morning sun danced across its surface, sending a cascade of diamonds scattering toward my porch. The air was warm, smelling of fresh-cut grass and the peonies blooming in my garden. The world was alive again, and in many ways, so was I. I sat in a comfortable wicker chair, a laptop open on the table in front of me. On the screen, a dozen friendly faces, all over the age of 60, smiled back at me. This was the inaugural video conference for the board of advisors for my new foundation. "Welcome, everyone," I said, my voice warm and clear. "I'm so thrilled to officially launch the Lantern for Later Years Foundation." I clicked a button, and my screen shared a simple, elegant logo, a stylized lantern, its light radiating outwards. "As you know," I continued, "our original mission was to provide pro bono legal aid to seniors facing guardianship abuse and financial exploitation. That mission remains our cornerstone. However, in light of my own recent experiences, we are expanding our mandate. Our first initiative will be a series of free, statewide workshops on digital security." A few of the board members nodded in enthusiastic agreement. "The world has changed," I said. "The old threats of scams and fine print still exist, but now there are new dangers, ones that can use your own voice and your own image against you. We're going to teach people how to spot phishing emails, how to secure their online accounts, and how to understand and identify the threat of deepfakes. We will not be victims. We will be the most informed, most prepared generation online. We will turn their weapons into our shields." I paused. "Now, for an update on our first pilot program, I'll turn it over to our volunteer coordinator in Chicago. Parker, are you there?" A new window popped up on the screen. It was my son. He was thinner than I'd seen him, the puffiness of stress and failure gone from his face. But his eyes were clear. He looked solid. He was sitting in a simple, sparse apartment, a world away from the lavish home he had shared with Sloane. "I'm here, Mom," he said. His voice was quiet, but steady. He looked directly into the camera. "Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to report that our first workshop here in Chicago is fully booked. We actually have a waiting list. The response has been overwhelming. People are eager to learn. They're grateful that someone is finally speaking to them, not down to them." We discussed logistics for another 20 minutes. Parker was professional, efficient. The way we spoke was different now. The easy intimacy of mother and son was gone, replaced by a careful, respectful distance. He was no longer my little boy. He was a man, rebuilding his life one brick at a time. He had chosen the first envelope. The hard road. Sloane had disappeared from our lives, her name now buried in a mountain of civil lawsuits and a pending investigation by the state bar. After the call ended, I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, a warm mug of tea in my hands. The fight was over. I had protected my husband's legacy, and in the process had discovered its true meaning. It wasn't just about the money. It was about using what you have to protect others. Arthur had done it for one family. I would now do it for thousands. I looked out at the glittering lake, at the brilliant blue sky. I thought of the long, dark winter, of the cold courtroom, of the terror and betrayal. They were all still a part of my story, scars that would never fully fade. But they were no longer the whole story. I had found a new purpose, a new chapter I never expected to write. I took a sip of my tea, and for the first time in a very long time I smiled. A real smile. A smile of peace. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.